Tired of copying builds in Warframe? After this guide, you'll never need to look them up again. You'll know exactly how to mod any gun for any situation. We'll start with the basics for base steel path, then work our way up to advanced tips for level cap. Quick heads up, this guide is all about guns. If you want a melee modding guide too, just let me know. And as always, timestamps are down below. Damage in Warframe is made up of 6 layers. Base damage, elemental mods, critical hits, multipliers, like faction mods, final damage multipliers, like Multishot, and final DPS multipliers, like fire rate. Each layer multiplies with the others. That's why diversifying your mods gives you the biggest gains. Stacking across different layers multiplies your total damage. For example, Serration gives a 165% base damage boost, but if you add heavy caliber, your damage only goes up by another 62%. That's because they stack additively. They're both base damage mods. The same thing happens with other mod types, like crit chance and crit damage. There is one exception. Some weapons have Multiplicative CO, where different base damage sources actually multiply instead of stacking additively. I'll explain how this works later in the advanced section. Before you even start modding a weapon, there's a few questions you need to ask. 1. Do I have external viral? And 2. Do I have external armor reduction? These matter because they directly affect how you mod your elements. If you don't have any armor stripping, make sure to run Corrosive in your build. Fully armored steel path enemies have 90% damage reduction, so stripping armor gives you a big damage boost. It also lets procs like heat and blast hit much harder. But if you've already got external armor stripping, you can skip Corrosive and run other elemental combos instead. Viral, on the other hand, is mandatory on almost every build. At max stacks, it boosts damage to health by 325%. But ideally, we don't mod for viral on the weapon itself. Instead, we outsource it. There are plenty of external sources: Nourish, Companions, Arcanes, and more. That frees up your weapon to run other elemental combos, like Blast or Corrosive. There are many other external buffs to keep in mind when modding, like fire rate, crit chance, or base damage buffs. But viral and armor reduction are the two most important to get right first. Next, you need to check the critical chance and status chance of your weapon to determine if it's worth modding for them. You typically want a minimum of 15 to 20% crit chance, with a 1.8x multiplier to justify crit mods. For status chance, 15 to 20% is also a good threshold, although lower values can still work due to more sources of status chance than crit. Now that we understand the 6 damage layers and how they interact, let's apply that to real builds. I'll walk you through how I mod a typical weapon for base steel path, using the Tenet Glaxian as an example. Later on, I'll show how to tweak your builds for level cap and more advanced scenarios. Let's start with the first layer, base damage. There are 2 main mods we can use here: Serration and Galvanized Aptitude. In most cases, Aptitude is the better choice. At full stacks, it nearly matches Serration with just 2 unique status effects on the enemy, and with 3 or more, it pulls ahead. On top of that, Aptitude gives an extra 80% status chance, which is a nice bonus. However, there are some situations where Serration or alternate base damage mods are actually the better choice, mainly on AoE weapons like the Kuva Ogress. That's because galvanized base damage mods only apply to direct hits. It doesn't affect the explosion radius, which is where most of the damage comes from on AoE weapons. Just a quick note, Aptitude does work on chaining or beam weapons, like the Kuva Nukor or Tenet Glaxian. It's specifically explosive AoE weapons where it doesn't apply. With that in mind, Galvanized Aptitude is the stronger option in our case, but I'll be using Serration for now, just to keep the upcoming damage calculations a bit simpler. This boosts our damage to 144. Layer 2 is elemental damage. Elemental mods are stronger than they look, because they multiply with your modded base damage, not just the base value. I've already got external viral from Nourish, so I don't need to mod for it. When it comes to choosing elemental combos, there are 2 main directions you can go. First is an AoE setup, usually Blast paired with Corrosive if you don't have any armor strip. That's what I'll run here since I don't have any. It's ideal for base steel path, where a high kill per minute is king. If you do have armor reduction, you can go with the Blast Electric hybrid. You'll get AoE from blast procs and strong single target damage from electric damage over time. The best of both worlds. The second option is a damage over time setup, typically Corrosive Heat. This has the highest single target DPS, but is usually overkill for regular Steel Path. It's more common in level cap builds, which I'll cover later in the video. So for this build, I'm using two 60/60 elemental mods for Corrosive, plus one heat mod to make Blast. That gives us a 180% elemental boost, bumping our modded damage to 404. The Tenet Galaxian already has an innate element, so I only need 3 mods to make this work. If your weapon doesn't, you've got a few options. You can outsource fire rate or base damage to free up a slot, or outsource armor strip and run blast electric instead. And don't worry, I'll break down every element and when to use them later in the video. Layer 3 is critical hits. Crits multiply your modded elemental damage by your critical multiplier, and even more if you're orange or red critting. Since we meet the minimum threshold of around 15 to 20%, we can slot in Point Strike and Vital Sense. That takes us to 50% crit chance with a 4.8x multiplier, pushing our damage on crits to 1,939. Layer 4 is Multipliers, like faction mods. These are really powerful because they multiply your entire modded damage, including critical hits. In our earlier example, we were critting for around 1900 damage. If we add primed Bane of Vernier, that jumps up to about 3000 damage. Faction mods also double dip on damage over time effects, but I'll cover that more in the advanced section. For this build though, I won't slot one in as they're only really needed for level cap or endurance setups. Next is Layer 5, Multishot, arguably the strongest stat in the entire game. Multishot acts as a final multiplier to all your modded damage, even after faction mods. I'm slotting in Galvanized Chamber here. At full stacks, it takes our multi-shot from 1 to 3.3. That's 3 guaranteed shots with a 30% chance at a 4th. Now, because I'm using a beam weapon, multi-shot behaves a little differently. Instead of adding extra projectiles, it directly multiplies our final damage and status chance. So if we have 3 multi-shot, that 3000 damage crit turns into 9000, and 112% status chance becomes 336%. On a regular weapon, you'd still get 3000 damage and 112% status, but you'd fire 3 projectiles instead of 1. The total output ends up about the same, just handled differently. That said, the slight difference actually makes multi-shot a bit stronger on beams, especially for builds that rely on status damage like heat or blast. That's because status damage scales off of your base damage and crits, which get multiplied on beam weapons. And since their status chance is also multiplied, we're still getting the same number of procs, they just hit harder. Now for the final layer, fire rate. Fire rate is pretty powerful since it's a direct multiplier to your burst DPS, since DPS is your damage times fire rate. For example, if our modded damage is 10,000 and our fire rate is 2, we have 20,000 burst DPS. If we double our fire rate, our DPS also gets doubled to 40,000. But if we say, doubled our damage from Serration to 330%, this would not double our DPS. Fire rate is basically multi-shot, but with the drawback of worse ammo efficiency. Since the Tenet Galaxian can benefit from punch through, I'm slotting in primed Shred. But if you don't need punch through, or just want max DPS, Vile Acceleration is a great alternative. Fire rate also has more external sources than any other stat, so it's a great one to outsource if you need the extra mod slot. For your Arcane, the big 3 are Primary Crux, Merciless, and Deadhead. Just use your best judgment here. Crux for damage over time builds, Merciless for general use, or Primary Blight if you're running Siren. For secondaries, all the same principles apply. The main difference is that secondaries have access to stronger and more flexible arcanes. Again, just use common sense here. If you're building for heat, obviously go with Cascadia Flare. If it's got low crit, then Innervate is best. Now let's go over each element so you'll know exactly which damage types to use in your builds. If you're short on time, there's a full summary at the end. Viral is basically mandatory on all builds. At 10 stacks, it boosts damage to health by 325%, including damage over time effects. It doesn't affect overguard or shields, however. Corrosive strips armor. At 10 stacks, it removes 80% of enemy armor. But if you're using 2 emerald shards, you can push that up to 14 stacks, giving you 100% armor strip. Blast is generally considered the strongest AoE element. At 10 stacks, it triggers a 5-meter explosion around your target, excluding the one you're directly shooting, dealing 3000% of your weapon's base damage. Even better, if you kill an enemy with at least 1 blast stack, it also triggers that same explosion. On the enemy you're actually shooting, Blast deals 30% of modded base damage per stack, up to 300% total. But keep this in mind, elemental mods don't boost your blast proc damage. Only base damage, faction mods, elementalist mods, and crits do. Gas has the biggest AoE in the game. It starts at 3 meters and increases by 0.3 meters per stack, capping at 6 meters. Plus, the clouds linger for 6 seconds, further amplifying its AoE. And yes, gas procs can headshot, but the base headshot multiplier is only 1x, so you'll need something like Primary Deadhead to get extra damage. So if gas has the biggest AoE, why is blast stronger? Because gas procs only deal half of your modded base damage, just 0.5x, which makes them pretty weak, especially on fast-firing weapons. And since gas and corrosive both use Toxin, you can't run them together. So against armored enemies, gas gets nerfed even further unless you have armor strip. Just like blast, elemental mods won't increase gas damage either. That said, don't always skip modding for gas. On weapons that can actually take full advantage of it, like the DQ Prime, it's easily one of the most broken damage types. Not only does it have massive base damage, it also gets an amalgam mod that boosts headshot damage by 75%. And remember, gas procs can headshot. Add Primary Deadhead, and your gas clouds can start doing serious damage. Next up is Magnetic, one of the most underrated damage types. At 10 stacks, it boosts damage to shields and overguard by 325%, basically viral for these enemies. And when you break shields or overguard, it forces an electric proc that deals up to 30% of the target's total shield or overguard as damage. It's percentage based, so it scales with enemy level. I'll break that down more in the advanced section, but just know, it's very strong. Radiation is probably the weakest combined element overall. It causes enemies to become confused and attack their allies. You should mostly run radiation only if the enemy is specifically weak to it, like Eidolons. Now into the single elements. Cold slows enemies. On the first proc, it adds a plus 0.1 flat critical multiplier, scaling up to 1x at 10 stacks. At 10 stacks, enemies are also frozen, but bosses and enemies with overguard can only receive up to 4 cold stacks. Think of cold as more of a utility element, not something you'd mod on your main weapon, but good for companions and primers. Electric is a surprisingly strong damage over time element. It stuns the target and applies a damage over time effect in a 3-meter radius. Unlike the elements we've covered so far, electric has no stack limit, meaning the damage can keep ramping up. And it's the only element besides gas that can headshot. Toxin is interesting. First, Toxin damage itself bypasses shields, even outside of the status effect. It works a lot like electric, no stack limit, but without the AoE and headshot potential. It's also harder to justify using because Toxin is a building block for both viral and corrosive, 2 of the best elements in the game. You'd usually only run raw Toxin for anti-shield builds, or for a primary blight setup. Finally, we have Heat, arguably the strongest damage over time in the game. Heat applies the damage over time and also reduces enemy armor by up to 50% after 2 seconds. Like electric and Toxin, it has no stack limit. But here's the difference. New heat procs refresh the duration of every existing one, so while electric and Toxin eventually reach a limit, heat can stack infinitely as long as you keep applying it. To summarize, viral is mandatory on almost every build, but should always be outsourced to Nourish or Companions ideally. Mod Corrosive if you don't have external armor strip. Blast is generally the strongest AoE, especially on beam or fast-firing weapons. It pairs well with Corrosive, if you can spare the mod slots. Gas has the biggest AoE of any element, and while it does low damage by default, it's incredibly broken on the right weapons. Only use it on weapons with very high base damage, ideally paired with something that boosts headshot multiplier, like Deadhead. Magnetic is basically viral for shields and overguard. It shines in Void Cascade against Thrax. Radiation and Cold are mostly skippable. Electric is a powerful dot, and is great with Blast if you've got Armor Strip. Toxin is decent, but tough to justify since it combines into Viral and Corrosive. Heat is your go-to dot if you just want raw DPS. One of the most common mistakes I see is players doing too much damage. In this example, I'm clearing level cap enemies with ease using quality of life mods like Amalgam Barrel Diffusion and Secondary Fortifier. I've got no major damage buffs either, just Nourish. Most players would have used Galvanized Diffusion and something like Primary Deadhead, giving up all of the quality of life benefits those two mods bring. And again, this was at level cap. On regular Steel Path, the difference would be completely unnoticeable. Just keep in mind, this mainly applies to stronger weapons like Incarnans. If you're using something weaker like the Stug or Ambassador, then yeah, you'll definitely feel the difference. For the first topic in the advanced section, I'll cover how Multiplicative CO works. It might sound complicated, but the core idea is actually very simple. To even activate Multiplicative CO, you need to be using one of the galvanized base damage mods, like Galvanized Aptitude. Let's walk through an example. Say you're using a weapon with 100 base damage, modded with Serration and a fully stacked Galvanized Aptitude, with 4 status effects on the enemy. That's 165% from Serration, and 320% from Aptitude. On most weapons, those bonuses are additive. That gives you 165% from Serration, but Aptitude suffers from diminishing returns, only giving an additional 121%. That totals out to 585 damage. But on a weapon with Multiplicative CO, those bonuses multiply instead of adding. Instead of 585, you get 1,113 damage, nearly double, just from how the math is handled. Weapons with Multiplicative CO work best alongside a primer, since Galvanized Aptitude's damage is based on the number of status effects on an enemy. You might be wondering, how do I know if a weapon has Multiplicative CO? I've linked a chart down in the description that lists which weapons have it, but keep in mind, it's a bit out of date. Another method is to check the weapon's wiki page, and scroll down to the known bugs section. If it has Multiplicative CO, there's a good chance it'll be mentioned there. In this section, I'll cover some common questions I had when modding. Then we'll go into level cap modding afterwards. Quick tip for damage over time setups. Try using unranked 60/60 mods. Anytime you're running a damage over time that stacks infinitely, like heat or electric, you want that element to have as much weighting as possible. That's because elements like Corrosive only have a 10 stack limit, so any extras go to waste. Say you're running a Corrosive heat build. Using unranked 60/60 mods for Corrosive will shift your weighting towards heat, which means far more heat procs, which is a huge DPS gain, especially over time. I got a lot of questions about this in my Void Cascade guide. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out. Just keep in mind, this only works well on high status weapons against high level enemies. On lower status weapons, Viral or Corrosive will take too long to reach 10 stacks, and at lower levels, enemies usually die before you can benefit from the extra heat procs. A good rule of thumb is, try the unranked mods and see how fast you hit 10 stacks of Viral or Corrosive. If it's quick, keep them. If it's slow, use fully ranked mods instead. Now this used to confuse me all the time. When should you use primed elemental mods, and when should you use 60/60 mods? If you're running a Corrosive Heat damage over time setup, obviously use primed heated charge over Scorch, no contest. But what about a non-damage over time setup, like Corrosive Blast? Should you go with primed heated charge or Scorch for Blast, and primed convulsion or Jolt for Corrosive? In general, stick with the primed mods. Primed heated charge won't boost the strength of your blast procs any more than Scorch would, but it gives you way more single target damage, and your blast AoE will still trigger just fine. Enemies only need one blast proc before dying to activate the 5-meter explosion. The same goes for Corrosive. The extra damage from primed mods is just too strong to pass up. Now if you're doing a Blast plus damage over time setup, like Blast Electric, then you should switch to Scorch. That'll shift the weighting towards Electric, which buffs your damage over time. One mistake I see all the time in builds is running Hunter Munitions. Before the Jade Shadows update, enemies had massive armor, so Slash, which ignores armor, was meta. But now, enemy armor caps at 2700, and their health is much higher instead. This is a indirect nerf to Slash. Slash also does the lowest damage of any dot, only 35% of your modded base damage, and it's not boosted by Slash mods either. In almost all cases, a setup like Corrosive Heat will beat it, even on weapons that seem perfect for Hunter Munitions. Here's a good example, the Baza Prime. It's a high crit, low status weapon, ideal for Hunter Munitions, but even here, Corrosive Heat kills noticeably faster. Lastly, I wanted to cover Point Strike versus Critical Delay. This might surprise you, but Point Strike almost always gives higher burst DPS than Critical Delay, because losing fire rate hurts more than you'd think. Let me show you why. Say we've got a weapon with 1000 base damage, 40% base crit chance, 5 fire rate, and a 10x crit multiplier. First, we calculate the average damage multiplier using this formula. With Point Strike, we hit 100% crit chance, giving us an average damage multiplier of 10. Multiply that by 1000 base damage for 10,000 per shot. Then we multiply by our fire rate, which is 5. That gives us 50,000 burst DPS. Critical Delay pushes the crit chance to 120%, which increases the average multiplier to 11.8. And yes, that includes the chance for orange crits. But since it lowers the fire rate to 4, the final DPS is only 47,200. And keep in mind, I purposely chose stats that favor Critical Delay. Even with orange crits and a huge multiplier, Point Strike still wins for burst DPS. Critical Delay can sometimes have higher sustained DPS, but only weapons with very poor ammo efficiency or slow reloads. In summary, Point Strike is ideal on full auto and beam weapons. Use it for maximum burst DPS. Use Critical Delay on semi-autos, weapons with poor ammo efficiency, or in squads where you could have potential fire rate buffs. For level cap modding, the same principles still apply. Always outsource Spiral, mod for Corrosive if you don't have armor reduction, and diversify your mod types to avoid diminishing returns. The big difference is that damage over time builds, and the mods that boost them, like Faction and Elementalist mods, become king. If you're going to level cap Cascade, you'll also need a way to deal with Overguard, as Thrax enemies have 15 million Overguard at level cap, nearly double their health. You'll also want to outsource things like base damage or fire rate whenever possible, to free up mod slots, especially on weaker weapons. I'll walk through a couple sample level cap builds, starting with the Kuva Nucor, then one that uses Multiplicative CO. First, I'll drop in all the essentials, crit, base damage, multi-shot, and so on. Crit chance is covered by Innervate, so I can skip modding for it. Since I don't have armor strip here, I'll mod for Corrosive Heat. I need a damage over time to maximize my DPS. I'll be getting viral from Nourish, so no need to mod for it. I can skip Magnetic since I already have it innately. You can also skip it if you're running Secondary Fortifier, or just outsource it to a Companion or Primer. If you're using a primary, I'd recommend outsourcing. They're much weaker than secondaries at level cap. Now for the final mod, it really depends on your goal. If you're building for Thrax and Void Cascade, Pistol Elementalist is your best option. Thrax don't belong to any faction, so faction mods won't work here. Elementalist mods are stronger than they seem. 90% status damage might sound low, but it's actually a final 1.9x multiplier applied directly to your status damage. And that comes after any faction multipliers, like Roar or Bane mods. Think of Elementalist mods as slightly weaker faction mods. If you're not fighting Thrax, a faction mod is by far the best pick. It boosts all modded damage by 1.55x, including crits, and it double dips on dots like heat. Here's what that means. When you proc heat, or any other status effects that can deal damage, the game applies faction damage twice, once to your base damage, and again after elemental bonuses. So instead of just a 55% increase, you actually get 1.55 squared, which is 2.4, or a 140% boost to your tick damage. Next, let's mod the Coda Base Assist, a weapon with Multiplicative CO. As usual, I'll start with the essential mods, crit, Multishot, and so on. But with weapons like this, which scale through Multiplicative CO, you don't really need a damage over time setup, even at level cap. I'm adding Deadhead and Prime Point Blank. No worries about diminishing returns here, since their bonuses will be multiplicative with Galvanized Savvy. Then I'll slot in both primed elemental mods. These are also multiplicative with base damage, which makes them especially strong on weapons like this. Finally, I'll add Scattering Inferno to create Blast, for a bit of extra AoE. This is the exact build you saw at the start of the video, one-shotting level cap enemies with ease. For the final section of this video, I'm covering some advanced mechanics, like Heat Inherit and the electric proc from Magnetic, which I mentioned earlier. Let's start with Heat Inherit. It sounds complicated, but it's actually really simple. Heat Inherit means the mods on the weapon that applies the first heat proc will continue to affect all future heat procs, even if you switch to a different weapon. For example, I might mod a Furus with primed Heated Charge, Scorch, and primed Expel Grenier. I apply a single heat proc with the Furus, then switch to the Ignis Wraith and keep applying heat procs. Even though I've switched to the Ignis, all of its heat procs still benefit from the mods on the Furus. It's overkill in most cases, unless you're using weaker weapons. Just remember, only heat and faction mods carry over. Things like base damage from the Furus won't transfer. It's an important mechanic to understand, because it can actually nerf your heat procs too. Let's say I'm using a Furus with the same setup as before, stacked with heat and faction mods. But if my companion lands the first heat proc instead, and the only heat related mod it has is Thermite Rounds, that weaker heat setup gets inherited. So now, all future heat procs on that enemy, even from the Furus, are stuck using that lower damage baseline. Now onto the tip about Magnetic. When you break the shields or overguard of an enemy affected by Magnetic, they get hit with a forced electric proc, dealing 3% of their max shields or overguard per magnetic status effect, up to 30% at max stacks. The damage from this electric proc is based on the weapon that applied the magnetic status, just like Heat Inherit. This effect is insanely powerful, because it does percent base damage. The more shields or overguard a target has, the harder it hits. You can boost the damage with Elementalist, Faction, and Electric mods, even if Electric is part of a combined element. Violet Archon shards also help. In this clip, I took out a level 215 Thrax with just the Electric proc alone, and at level cap, it's even stronger since Thrax have more overguard than health. Just make sure to armor strip, it makes a huge difference. One last thing, while everything in this video will help you mod most weapons correctly, Warframe is a complex game, and some weapons have quirks that many players don't even realize. For example, on the Torrid, the spherical radius does not benefit from Multishot. Only enemies directly hit by the main beam will. Or with the Burst-In Incarnon, the AoE component ignores Multishot entirely. These are just a couple examples, but there are plenty more, both good and bad. So it's worth checking the wiki or doing a quick test before finalizing your build. Even veteran players get caught off guard by hidden interactions like these. And that wraps up the guide. If you found it helpful, leave a like, and feel free to drop any questions in the comments. I'm happy to help.